The fear, of course, is that the government may use this social credit scoring system to punish people.
They plan to have a nationwide social credit system in place. This will give every Chinese citizen.
Actually, it's going to be very effective as it's going into the future, especially if you go to a cashless society.
You've probably heard this before. A single number, a score, assigned to every citizen in China. It goes up when you behave, it goes down when you don't. Cross a street at the wrong time, and you lose points. Say the wrong thing online, your score drops. Buy too many video games, your number tanks. And once that number falls below a certain line, you can't fly, you can't take a train, you can't get a job, you can't send your kids to a good school. Your face appears on a giant screen in the town square, and everyone around you, everyone you know, starts pulling away, because being near you could hurt their score too. That's the version of the story you've been told, by documentaries, by news anchors, by politicians in Washington and London and Brussels. And it sounds terrifying. It sounds like something ripped out of a dystopian novel. A real-life Black Mirror episode running in real time applied to 1.4 billion people. But here's the thing. That system, the one I just described, that single, all-seeing score that monitors your every move and punishes you in real time, it doesn't exist. It has never existed. And the more you look into what is actually happening inside China, the more you realize that the real story is far stranger, far more boring in some places, far more alarming in others, and almost nothing like what most people think. This is where the story actually begins. In the year 2000, a group of researchers at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences compiled a document called the National Credit Management System. China at the time was deep in the chaos of rapid modernization. Hundreds of millions of people were entering the formal economy for the first time. They were borrowing money. They were starting businesses. They were signing contracts with strangers across provinces they had never visited. And the country had almost no infrastructure to determine who could be trusted with a loan, who would honor a contract, or who was running a scam. There was no FICO, no Equifax, no TransUnion. Less than a quarter of the population had any kind of credit history at all. Premier Zhu Rongji read that document and told 10 ministries to start studying the problem. He used a very specific phrase. He said China must vigorously rectify social credit. And that phrase, social credit, was not about surveillance. It was not about cameras or AI or moral policing. It was about trust, financial trust, legal trust, the basic infrastructure that allows a modern economy to function without every transaction being a gamble. That's the origin, a bureaucratic attempt to build something that the West had spent decades constructing and China was now racing to catch up on. Fast forward to 2014. The State Council published what is now the most cited document in any discussion of this topic, the Planning Outline for Building a Social Credit System. And this is where the confusion exploded. Because the document laid out broad goals. It talked about trustworthiness. It talked about rewards and punishments. It talked about government integrity, business compliance, and something called social moral standards. Western media picked up the document. Translation circulated, and very quickly the narrative locked in. China was building a universal scoring system, a citizen rating machine, and by 2020, every person in the country would be assigned a number. 2020 came and went. No universal score appeared, because that was never the plan. This is the part nobody explains. What China calls the social credit system is not a single system. It is not even one coherent program. It is a loose collection of initiatives spread across dozens of government agencies, operating at different levels, with different rules, different databases, and different goals. Some of them are about financial creditworthiness, some are about court enforcement, some are about corporate regulation, and a few, mostly at the local level, experimented with personal scoring pilots that have since been scaled back or abandoned entirely. The closest thing to a backbone in this ecosystem is a set of blacklists, and these blacklists are not mysterious. They are not driven by AI. They are driven by courts. The most significant one is the Judgment Defaulter List, maintained by the Supreme People's Court. It targets a very specific group of people, individuals and companies that have lost a court case, have been ordered to pay a fine or repay a debt, and have refused to comply despite having the ability to do so. As of 2025, roughly 200,000 additional people were added to this list in a single year, nearly half for contractual disputes. Before anyone is placed on it, they receive written notification. They are told the legal basis, and there is a court process for appeal and removal. The penalties attached to this list are real. If you're on it, you can't book a first-class flight. You can't ride high-speed rail. You can't stay in luxury hotels. You can't send your children to expensive private schools. The restrictions are designed to target high-end consumption, not basic needs. The idea, blunt as it is simple. If you owe someone money and you have the means to pay, you shouldn't be flying business class and staying at five-star resorts. It is a coercive compliance tool. Crude, yes, but it is not an automated surveillance machine reading your thoughts. Then there's the no-fly and no-ride list, and these are separate. They have nothing to do with your finances. They exist because people misbehave on planes and trains. Smoking in the cabin, assaulting flight attendants, using counterfeit tickets. If you do these things, you get banned from buying new tickets for 6 to 12 months. That is the only penalty. It does not bleed into other areas of your life. It does not affect your job or your mortgage. And then there's the one that caused more confusion than anything else. Sesame Credit, the program that launched 1,000 headlines. A numerical score, visible in an app, that rates Chinese citizens and controls their lives. Except Sesame Credit was never a government program. It was a private initiative by Ant Financial, an Alibaba affiliate. It was an opt-in commercial loyalty program designed to assess the trustworthiness of users within the Alibaba shopping ecosystem. Higher scores meant deposit waivers on bike rentals, hotel perks, faster access to small loans. Lower scores meant nothing. No punishment, no penalty, no public shaming. It was closer to an airline frequent flyer program than to anything resembling state surveillance. And here is the critical detail that most coverage leaves out. When the People's Bank of China, the central bank, evaluated Sesame Credit and 7 other private pilots for possible use as a national credit tool, it denied them all licenses. The central bank criticized Sesame Credit for collecting excessive data and for conflicts of interest, since spending more on Alibaba's own platforms could boost the score. The program was never integrated into any government system. It eventually evolved into what it always functionally was, a commercial reward scheme. An Alibaba executive once casually mentioned that people who bought diapers might be considered more trustworthy than people who played video games all day. That offhand remark was reported globally as evidence that China was scoring citizens based on their shopping habits. Sesame Credit later denied any such metric was ever implemented, but the damage was done. The myth had legs. This is where things change, because once you strip away the myth, you're left with something that is still worth paying very close attention to, not because it's the dystopian monster the media built, but because the infrastructure underneath it is massive and growing. The National Credit Information Sharing Platform, the real data hub behind the system, had collected over 80 billion records by early 2025, covering roughly 180 million businesses. Over 33 million companies had been given some form of corporate credit rating. The 2024 to 2025 action plan released by the National Development and Reform Commission called for accelerated legislation, better data integration, and expanded monitoring across sectors like real estate, finance, and internet services. And in March 2025, the Communist Party's Central Committee issued 23 new guidelines designed to unify the system nationally, standardize enforcement, protect personal data, and introduce blockchain for traceability. In other words, the system isn't slowing down, it's professionalizing. The focus has shifted heavily toward corporate compliance, not individual scoring. The most active enforcement targets are businesses that commit fraud, violate safety regulations, or break environmental laws. Government agencies themselves are being rated on their trustworthiness, and there is a growing emphasis, at least on paper, on privacy protection, proportional enforcement, and the right to appeal and have records corrected. A social credit law, which would provide the first comprehensive legal foundation for the entire system, is still under legislative review. It hasn't passed. Provincial regulations continue to vary. Enforcement across regions remains uneven. The infrastructure to connect databases across ministries and provinces is still being built. The system, in its actual state, is messy, bureaucratic, and incomplete. But the direction is unmistakable. China is building a regulatory ecosystem where compliance records follow you, where your history with government agencies, courts, and regulators becomes part of a searchable, shareable profile, where being flagged in one domain can have consequences in another. This is where the story shifts, because while the world has been staring at China, something very similar has been taking shape in the West. It just doesn't carry the same name, and it doesn't come from the government. It comes from the private sector. In the United States, your FICO score has determined your access to credit, housing, and increasingly your insurance rates for over 3 decades. But FICO was just the beginning. Behind it sits an invisible infrastructure of data brokers. Companies like LexisNexis, which maintains financial profiles on virtually every American adult, and sells data to insurers, lenders, employers, and law enforcement. Companies like Axiom, which holds behavioral and demographic data on over 2.5 billion consumers globally. Companies like Equifax Workforce Solutions, which, through its acquisition of the Work Number, holds employment and income verification records for tens of millions of Americans, and sells that data to lenders, background check companies, and government agencies. Tenant screening companies generate 3-digit scores that determine whether you can rent an apartment. They scrape court records, purchasing data, and credit histories, and feed them through automated systems that produce risk assessments landlords treat as gospel. These systems are frequently inaccurate. They surface eviction filings that never became judgments, arrests that never led to convictions, records that belong to someone else entirely with a similar name, and they disproportionately impact Black and Latino renters, who are more likely to be flagged due to over-policing and name-matching errors. Employers run credit checks on job applicants. Insurers adjust your premiums based on predictive models that ingest data you never consented to share. Fintech platforms build behavioral profiles based on how frequently you trade, how you respond to market volatility, and what time of day you check your balance. And all of it operates through private companies, with minimal regulatory oversight, no unified right to appeal, and almost no transparency about what data is collected, how it's weighted, or who it's sold to. The United States has over 750 registered data brokers. California had to pass a law, the Delete Act, just to give residents a mechanism to submit a single deletion request to all of them at once. That tool launched in January 2026. Before it, you had to contact each broker individually. Most people didn't even know they existed. None of this is called a social credit system. Nobody uses that phrase. But the architecture is functionally identical. Your data is collected without your knowledge, aggregated into profiles you can't see, scored by algorithms you can't audit, and used to make decisions about your housing, your employment, your insurance, and your freedom to participate in the economy. The difference is not in what is being built. The difference is in who is building it. In China, the state leads and the data is theoretically subject to administrative law, judicial review, and newly emerging privacy protections. In the West, private corporations lead and the data is subject to market forces, terms of service nobody reads, and regulatory frameworks written decades before the technology they're supposed to govern. And this convergence is not limited to the United States and China. India's Aadhaar system has assigned a 12-digit biometric identity number to over 1.3 billion people. It was designed to reduce fraud in welfare delivery, and it has. But it has also become mandatory for accessing banking, phone service, and government benefits, even though the Supreme Court ruled that participation should be voluntary. The EU is rolling out a digital identity wallet by 2027 that will link driver's licenses, diplomas, bank accounts, and health records into a single digital profile. The UK announced a mandatory digital ID scheme in late 2025, framed as a tool to curb illegal migration and streamline public services. Singapore's SingPass already integrates facial recognition and has achieved over 95% adoption. And in city after city, country after country, the same pattern repeats. Digital identity systems start with a narrow, practical purpose. They expand. They connect to more services. They collect more data. And the distance between a digital ID and a trustworthiness profile gets shorter every year. This is the part that should make you uncomfortable. Not because China built something evil and the rest of the world is copying it, but because the rest of the world has been building its own version for years, and the only reason it doesn't feel like a social credit system is because no one calls it one. The popular image of China's social credit system, the single score, the AI overlord, the cameras watching your every move, was always a projection. A mirror held up to Western anxieties about technology, control, and the future of governance. European misconceptions about the system became so widespread, so detached from reality, that Chinese internet users began treating them as a source of entertainment. Researchers have called this phenomenon techno-orientalism, the tendency to see China not as a real place with real people and real bureaucratic messiness, but as an abstract dystopia, a cautionary tale about what happens over there. Meanwhile, over here, the infrastructure of behavioral monitoring has quietly become the foundation of modern economic life. Your ability to rent a home, get a loan, find a job, buy insurance, and move freely through the financial system is shaped by scores and profiles and algorithms you have never seen and have almost no power to challenge. The social credit system was never really about China. It was always about a question that every connected society on Earth is now being forced to answer. How much should institutions know about you? How should that knowledge be used? And who gets to decide? China answered that question loudly, with state planning documents and national policy directives, and the world recoiled. The West answered the same question quietly, through terms of service, data broker registrations, and private sector innovation, and almost nobody noticed. The system isn't coming. It didn't arrive from the East. It grew from the ground beneath your feet, and the only real difference is whether you can see it.